Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our end of year seminar. It is my pleasure to introduce our final speaker in this series, one of our own, Dr. Melissa Price. Dr. Price earned her bachelor's degree in biology from Walla Walla University in Washington State and her doctorate in biology from Loma Linda University in California. Like many of the outstanding professors in our department, Dr. Price brings expertise across a diverse range of areas, including wildlife and endangered species management, climate change adaptation, behavioral ecology, population genetics and genomics, and decision-making. In her research, Dr. Price has explored topics such as management strategy for ungulates, as well as behavioral ecology and genetics of seabirds, Hawaiian waterbirds, shorebirds, and short-eared owls. Today, Dr. Price will present her talk titled Transforming Hawaii from the Endangered Species Capital of the World to the Recovery Capital. Without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speaker, Dr. Price.
Thank you so much for coming. I know that this is a stressful and busy time of year. I know a few of you, undergraduate students, both in my classes and a few other folks' classes I was informed, were bribed to be here with extra credit. I'm still grateful for you being here. And for all of the colleagues that I get to see, fantastic to have you here. So I'm really excited to talk with you about this. I haven't spoken for seminar in about, since I started organizing it, which was in 2016, because I didn't invite myself. So this is the first seminar I've given for the department since 2016 or 2017 when I interviewed for my tenure track position. So I'm about to go on sabbatical, and it seemed like a good time to fill the spot at the end of the semester and force myself to have a deadline to lay out some of the ideas that I want to work on over sabbatical. So this is a big picture talk, a little bit more than a small picture talk. So it's not as narrowly focused on a single research project, but more of an overview and a vision. So thank you again for being here today. My work began at the University of Hawaii working on Hawaiian tree snails, or kahuli. And I spent many happy days up in the mountains collecting very teeny tiny tissue samples off the end of the tail of the snails. And I'd sit on the cliff sides, and those who were working with me would crawl over the cliff sides, finding them for me, bringing them over. I'd get a small sample and they'd take them back. So I was sitting on the cliffside, enjoying the beautiful views of the Ko'olau Mountains, looking out over the ocean on both sides of the island. And it was absolutely amazing. These snails here, Actinella lila, are found in Peahinaya. Up above, you have to hike about 7 hours up the Po'omoho Trail and then down a cliffside. We were lucky enough to get dropped off by helicopter quite a bit of the time, and then hike another hour down the cliffside to these snails. So the last time I visited this population was in 2015 or so, when I was finishing up some sampling and needing to do some vegetation surveys. David Sisko, who's the Snail Extinction Prevention Program Coordinator, called me up in about 2018. And he said, we went up to this valley to evacuate the snails because they were seeing populations start to blink out across the top of the mountains. And so he said, we flew up there with a team of 4. We searched for 20 hours. We found 1 snail. And when I had been there in 2015, we had sampled about 50 snails. We usually have about a 20% detection probability based on studies that we've done. And so it went from a population of at least 300 down to nothing in 3 years' time. And so this is what I started my career at the University of Hawaii working on, my first real job after getting my PhD. And so I think it's no coincidence that the Hawaiian name for the Hawaiian tree snails is kahuli, to change or alter. Without the kako, it's also kahuli, to overturn, overthrow, capsize, or upset. And so I think a lot about ho'okahuli. How do we create turning points, transformation, innovation, movement, and change? At the beginning of the semester, I had the 10 or so students who are enrolled in this course do a kind of a life map of the impact that they want to have over the course of their professional lifetimes and their pathway to getting there. And so I wanted to give myself the same challenge. I had a whole semester, they had 1 week. And so this is what I wanted to kind of outline and what I'm going to build my talk around today. The life goal that I'd like to invest the next 40 years of my time in is building pilina, restored relationships. When I lost those kahuli, I didn't realize how much it would impact me to know that they weren't up in the mountains. Every day when I drive home, I drive over the pali, And I look at these invasive forests and I think about what it might take to restore them, and I'm absolutely overwhelmed. And I didn't realize what an emotional hope it offered me to know that there were these kipuka, these pockets of kohuli that were up in the mountains. And all of a sudden to know that they weren't there anymore devastated me. I went through depression. It felt like losing a family member. Now, these are snails. That's something that you just don't share with normal people, that like you went through depression over the extinction of a snail. But it's something that shaped things. And if I felt that loss over a species that I had only had a couple of years of relationship with, and had only spent time with this particular population in the mountains a handful of times, I can't even imagine what these losses feel like to Indigenous people and Hawaiians who had these relationships with these species for 1,000 years. And to lose those generational stories that go along with these species, to lose the relationship where you're telling your grandchildren about something that you can never walk them up the mountain to see. I have just a small taste of that. And so as I do work to restore species and restore populations, it's embedded in this idea that we're not just saving species because we're tree huggers or something like this, but it's about restoring those relationships so that when I tell people about these, they go, oh yeah, I saw that last week. Oh yeah, I heard an EEV outside my window, right? So that's what everything is embedded around. There's different areas that then I want to spend my time over the next 40 years, and that my lab has been spending time to support that restoration of Pilina. So that's effective conservation actions, which I'm going to talk a bit about today. These are all developed through co-developed research questions and working together with communities, the community Kuleana, and reestablishing that pairing of rights and responsibilities. That answering questions around diversified and sustained funding. I started working on my master's in business administration this year because I realized that I had reached the end of what my PhD in biology could lead me to in my ability to teach myself. And I needed to be able to answer questions about diversified and sustained funding. I'll give you a glimpse into some of the things I'm starting to think about around there. And then I won't spend much time on effective policy today, but I'll mention that it underlies everything. We can't do the rest of the work without effective policy. And so in all of these areas, as things pop up, we're trying to work with the appropriate people to ensure that effective policy changes happen. So Hawaii is known as the extinction capital of the world. A few years ago, I got absolutely irritated having this be the start of every talk I heard. And so how did we get here to, well, we got here because historically the entire Hawaiian Island chain was available for species. And then over the last 300 years, we had land clearing for various purposes: plantation agriculture, grazing of cattle industry, sandalwood industry, all of these things that cleared land over the last 300 years. And there's simply not as much habitat, as much area available to hold these species as there were historically. And so we have much smaller spaces, which means much smaller populations. Add into that the major introductions over the last 300 years to the loss of pollinators, the habitat altering invasive species, the overcollection of kahuli and other species, the diseases such as avian malaria that are impacting our forest birds, and the invasive predators and competitors. And these factors are all present still in the environment, and new threats are emerging with every Christmas tree shipment. I don't know if you saw the news on the recent snake that was found. Please, please, please go to Halamano, cut down a locally grown Christmas tree. Or go get a $10 permit and go into the forest and harvest one yourself, one of our invasive trees. Easy solution so you don't contribute to this problem. Climate change increases pressure on this entire system by impacting the survival and reproduction of these species. So both the invasive species and the native species. And so you get changing dynamics over time. So over the next 40 years of my career, I would like to ask the question, how can we shift from being the extinction capital of the world to being the recovery capital of the world? I would like to suggest that right now, for many of our species, particularly the ones listed on the endangered species list, which is about 586 species, we are in triage mode just trying to prevent them from going extinct. We need to go through triage, growth, stability, and thriving. And so the first portion of this talk in part one, I'm going to take you through how can we take species from the brink of extinction to growing and stable. And the second portion of the talk, I'll talk to you about how we maybe can get to thriving. So how do we create a thriving and responsive system to achieve recovery in Aina Momona or fat land, or the ability to actually maybe have those interactions that with those species again into the future. So if we use this as a framework, the first portion that I want to talk to you about is looking at the effective conservation actions through some co-developed research that we're just completing. The publication will be coming out in the next year. If you want to read the details, then include all of those margins of uncertainty and all of the aspects of it. The ones I'm going to show to you today, the portion of this is a more simplified version so that we can kind of move quickly through a few thoughts. So how do we take species from the brink of extinction to growing and stable? The challenge and the problem that we're trying to solve is that we've got many species to protect. We've got many threats to those species that we need to address, and we have limited resources to address those problems. In fact, in the Hawaiian Islands, we have 25% of the nation's endangered species, and we're given 3% of the federal funds to manage those species because the allocation of funds is based off of land area and human population, not the need. Okay, so we have a mismatch between the scope of the need, the scope of the breadth of the need and the need and the resources to manage it. So if we think about the different actions that we could take to manage those species, we have a hard choice. And there are many different actions we could take. Actions differ in costs, in benefits, and in efficacy. So if we think about the very simple example of a rat, we can control a rat with a trap. That's a pretty cheap cost per trap, but it only controls rats. Or we can build a predator-free fence. That predator-free fence is going to keep out all of our invasive mammals, the rats, the cats, the mongoose, the dogs. It costs more upfront, but it has a higher efficacy. So choosing between those things, we might have a challenging choice to make. But what do we do when we have hundreds of actions we could take across hundreds of species, across hundreds of areas? How do we make those decisions? So there is a process that's been developed by folks in Australia and also at University of British Columbia. It was first applied in New Zealand for how to make decisions across hundreds of species. And so I'm going to give you an overview of our first application of that in the Hawaiian Islands. So if we want to achieve stable populations of endangered species, we first work with managers to say, well, which species do we want to consider here? In most cases, we can use some rules like, well, which ones are listed as endangered or which ones should be listed as endangered. So you identify those species, you say, what are the threats to those species? And what are the actions we can take to address those threats? And then for each of the management strategies that we group up with those groups of actions, we identify the cost of those conservation actions, and we identify the benefit of those conservation actions. We then do a process that comes out of the business world called an optimization. It's a cost-benefit analysis to say, what's the maximum benefit we can get given a particular budget or given a certain amount of money? Currently in conservation, we're often shopping without a price tag. We don't know what it actually costs to save species, and we don't know which actions are the best to take to move the needle. So this process can get us there. We've had the opportunity to apply this for the first time on the 4 islands of Maui Nui. So we worked with managers on the islands of Maui Nui. They identified 372 species that they wanted us to apply this to. These are everything from birds, bats, snails, insects, and over 200 species of plants. 372 species is too many to run individual PVAs for, population viability analysis models for. And so we group those first into 15 species groups that are likely to respond similarly to action. So for example, we group all the water birds together, we group all the forest birds together, and those, while there are definitely differences between them, they respond more similarly to actions than say like the difference between seabirds and plants or something like that. So you're able to kind of get away with this approach to look across the hundreds of species. We then identified, we worked with over 100 experts to identify 27 strategies to address the threats to these 372 species. One strategy, you should always, always, always compare doing something to doing nothing. So the first strategy is just answering the question, what if we did nothing? Where would they be at in 20 years? The second set, there were 16 independent action sets. I'll show you a little bit about what those look like in a moment. And then there were 10 combinations of independent action sets because we usually don't just do one type of action. So these are the 16 independent action sets. There are insane spreadsheets that go with this that I will not bore you with, but essentially I want you to understand that there is a level of detail underlying every one of these where it is 20 years of conservation actions, every tech, every admin time, every bit of materials, the contracting, the surveying you need to do before you build a fence, everything, and the research and development and the vehicles. I mean, it's everything. So we identified all of that for these 17 strategies. The colors aren't coming through strongly if you're on the side, but I think out front you can see the colors okay. In yellow, it's all strategies to address ungulate issues. In green, it's the 2 strategies to address habitat management. In purple are all the strategies to address predators. In light blue are all the strategies that aren't covered by other things specific to rare plants and invertebrates. And then the last 4 are all strategies having to help birds and bats. So they're vertebrate specific kinds of things, okay? And then the 10 additional strategies that get us to 27 are just combinations of these things. So we've got those 27 strategies, and we want to know what is the benefit of each of those 27 strategies for each of the 15 species groups. Okay, so what do we mean by benefit? Well, we mean probability of persistence. It's a fancy way of saying at 0, they go extinct. At 100, they're doing great and you can walk away. For endangered species, we are actually thrilled if we can get to the 50% mark where they are stable. We can't walk away, but they're stable. Okay, so in most cases, that's the goal we're working toward. I'm not saying it's what we want. I'm saying it's what's real. Okay, is to get to the 50% mark. And we were interested in this over 20 years. Most endangered species in part are endangered because their life cycles are really slow. And so it takes a while for them to respond to your conservation actions. So we wanted to give 20 years of predictions, but you don't want to get out beyond what people can imagine. If you go out and you say, imagine 100 years from now, they're like, yeah, I'm going to be dead. So they can't imagine it. You have to keep it within a portion of time that folks can actually think about the implementation. All right, so first we want to know what happens without action. In all cases, of course, they're going to decline. And then we want to know if you take the action, what's the benefit you get? All right, so this is the concept. We used what's called a modified Delphi method. Please read Dr. Bergman's papers if you want to know more about the Delphi method. But essentially what you do is this is an expert elicitation where for each species group, you have 8 to 12 experts on that species group, which provide an independent estimate of the probability of persistence under each strategy over the next 20 years as follows. We want to know what's the highest plausible estimate you can imagine, what's the lowest plausible estimate you can imagine, and what's your best guess estimate. We then have an anonymous share out, and I'm telling you the most value that happens in this is from that anonymous share out and discussion. So you just graph it out, you show them and you say, can you imagine why someone would predict that it would be this high, or can you imagine why someone would predict it would be this low? Things pop out of those discussions, like David Sisko with the Snail Extinction Prevention Program saying, please, please, please understand that if you control rats, those rats are eating the invasive rosy wolf snails that are eating our native snails. So what happens when you kill the predator of a predator? That pops up, that the thing you're trying to manage goes down and you have an unintended consequence. So even just the value of having those conversations in a room, helping folks to understand that what I'm doing to manage plants might hurt the snails, things like that are incredibly valuable. We capture all of that, and that's all metadata we share out afterward. They can then change their values if they want to. So we don't make them stick with their first number. If they learn something new and they want to change it, they can. Initial results, I'm going to walk you through this, okay? So in black, we have the bars showing if you do nothing, what happens? Here's the really bad news. You're at 10 to 40% persistence if you do nothing, okay? The white dot shows you where they are today, and the blue bar shows you where we can get to if we implement the best out of those 27 strategies for each of those taxonomic groups. So if we do the best we can, we get to about 40 to 60% probability of persistence. Again, if you are used to working on species where you get to deal with 80s and 90s and 100s, I'm happy for you. Lucky you. But I am absolutely thrilled to get these species to between 40 and 60% probability of persistence where they are no longer on the brink of extinction. How do we get to this point? I want to point out just a few things. Oh, and by the way, I'm told U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service told me they would probably delist at 50 to 60. So just a reinforcing idea of like, yeah, this is not a bad thing. This is, you know, you're getting them to stable. It's not where we want to be in the end, but you're getting them to stable. So what about which of those 27 strategies performs best across all species? We want to know about co-benefits of the actions we take. And so we can think again about if we take no action, if we take some action, and then we're specifically interested in this benefit. What if we take that benefit for each of those 15 species groups and we stack them for each of those 27 strategies? That'll tell me which strategies do the best across species. Are you with me? Okay, busy graph coming up. So if we take a look at this graph, what I want you to notice is that strategies perform differently. Some actions do great for a lot of species. Some actions, this one right here, see here, I have to use this so the online folks can see it too. This one right here is avian malaria stuff. It is absolutely essential to save the forest birds. If you don't do that, you lose the forest birds. And I don't want to live in a world without EEV. So you lose the forest birds if you don't do that action, but it doesn't have a lot of benefits for other species, other than like really cascading benefits that are kind of ethereal. All right, so most important take-home message. The combinations of existing and future actions are what get us to that point of stability. This is actually where I take a deep breath and get just a little bit panicky and what sent me over to take my MBA program. Because what this means, I showed you those individual action sets. What I want to point out is all of these ones are things we're not doing yet. Okay, so you have to do basically all of this if you want to get all of those 372 species to 40 to 60%. So you need to build those future ungulate fences that are planned. You need to build the future predator-proof fences for the snails and the seabirds and the water birds. You need to do landscape scale rodent suppression on Ko'olawe. You need to develop these future tools. You know, like if we don't figure out how to control rosy wolf snails, you can never put kahuli back out on the landscape. We've got to solve the avian malaria problem. Huge, huge, huge problem. And we've got to deal with the infrastructure issues. And Maui would like to have a wildlife recovery center on Maui so they don't have to fly them over to Hawaii Island every time a bird gets injured. So those are the kinds of things that need to happen. You might be asking, where's community in all this? We've been talking about the money and we will talk about money. We've been talking about the benefit of all those different actions for the species. I want to highlight that around this point in the research, we were really working hard to identify community involvement in the different actions. And where we ended up is thinking about, there's two concepts I want to present to you here. The first one is on the far right end of the spectrum, there are some actions that it's really easy to engage community in. These are things like low-E restoration, which is absolutely fantastic for water birds. Things like seabird habitat restoration, stuff like that is easy to engage community in. Everyone can hop in and help. Forest restoration. There are things like solving avian malaria and the mosquito problem. You need specialized permits, you need specialized technology, and a whole lot of money that the community just doesn't have the expertise, the technology, the money to do. And so there are some aspects that are super warm and fuzzy. You can pull community and you can all get together and solve this problem. There are other things that kind of take a lot of government intervention to make those solutions happen. So I just want to highlight that spectrum. And then I want to talk briefly and highlight that if you didn't get to see Amy Sato's talk, this is actually where her research happened. We were looking across all of these different conservation actions and saying, how do we ensure that community is engaged, that community is involved, that appropriate engagement with communities is happening. And so we ran this workshop at the Hawaii Conservation Conference and developed that report that's now available for folks to implement. If you want to see that talk, the link is available, as all these seminars are recorded and available on YouTube. So please do review that. I won't spend the time on it today, but absolutely beautiful work. And so thankful for Amy's leadership on that. So that's an aspect of community kuleana that we've thought a little bit about so far, a lot about. Amy's talk spent the whole time telling you about it, so sorry, that's not today's talk. I mentioned diversified sustained funding. So I don't know if you remember, but in this thing, I actually showed you that we did elicit costs, and I didn't talk to you about that yet. And so I'm going to give you a brief overview. What does it actually cost to get those species to stable, right, over the next 20 years? So here's the big graph. It costs about $1 billion over 20 years. Okay, you and I look at that and go, oh, yikes. My team presented this at the Society for Decision Professionals in April. I am telling you, it's a bunch of business people, healthcare professionals, and military. They don't blink an eye at this. Wait, that's for the whole 20 years of actions? Why haven't you solved this yet? Right? One of those billionaires can write you a check tomorrow for $1 billion. We've got the next 20 years of conservation on Maui Nui funded. No problem.
You live in Kauai.
No problem, exactly. Yes, we're going there eventually too. So these numbers actually to us feel like awful, and to the rest of the world, they're like, this is not a problem, okay? Where is the money going? Jobs for you, right? Okay, so job security into the future. And these are the things that give me hope also, which is that this is where those non-recurring costs are going, which are about 67 million of it. It's going into the new fences, the disease research and development, field vehicles, the predator eradication on Ko'olave, policy development, and propagation and rehab facilities. These are things that one of those billionaire donors can put nameplates on, which means they're easy donations, I'm told. So, I think there's a lot of fundraising in my future. So how do we diversify funding? And this is, again, what drove me to the MBA. Our current funding mechanisms are state funds, federal funds, and private, nonprofit, and corporate donors. From conversations with folks like Suzanne, it's been really clear that our current funding levels from the state and federal government are not likely to change. We've got the money we're going to have. If anything, they might go down in a few years. The next few years, we'll see. But we need to think beyond that if we're going to actually achieve recovery. And so first, the question people often ask me at this point is, well, what are we currently spending? And nobody knows. So we need to actually have a study. I'm hoping to find a grad student who's interested in these intersections of finance and conservation in the next few years. Normally when students come to me, they want to cuddle animals. And so they're not wanting to spend their time staring at spreadsheets. So hopefully in the next couple of years, I can get that going. And this will help us to understand where the gaps are so that we can expand on our potential funding mechanisms. People are exploring things like green fees. They're already exploring things like conservation banking. There will likely be a bill going before the legislature, I believe, this spring. So keep an eye on that to see those conversations. I'm not convinced of, I think there's a lot of deep thought needed on this. I'll just say that. Carbon credits, also an area of needing deep thought, but I think potentially more useful locally than globally. Maybe that's where I'm starting to think about on that. Anyways, lots of thought needed. Corporate kuleana programs and expanded external donor programs. So this is where I think I might spend more of my life than I expected to as a wildlife conservation person. So hopefully I've shown you how we can take species from the brink of extinction to growing and stable. You have to be able to imagine something before you can do it. And so I think I can now imagine how we do that step. Where I think I have a hard time dreaming how this will happen in my lifetime, but I have a few ideas now. How do we create thriving and responsive systems to achieve recovery in Aina Momona? So I would challenge you that if we're going to do this, the lens through which we view the world has to change. You've heard a lot of seminars this semester that went into circular economies and all kinds of things that essentially challenge our assumptions about how the world works and challenge us to think outside of those constructs. One of those that we've spent a few years thinking about over the last few years, I worked with Doctors Price, I am Dr. Price, with Doctors Jackson. I do work with myself. Doctors Jackson and Winter. Anne-Marie Jackson is a Maori professor in Aotearoa who's done amazing work on communities and health and conservation. And Dr. Winter, he spoke earlier in the semester. And so we worked together on a paper that was the title paper in a special issue on transforming conservation biology through Indigenous perspectives. It's well known that conservation biology is a triage field. It's an emergency room, stop the bleeding kind of a field. And we've stayed there for 50 years. We have not gotten out of that mindset. So in the field of psychology, there's this thing called the scarcity mindset. And it's this pervasive feeling of not having enough. That's us in conservation. We're working on shoestring budgets. We're paying people much less than what they're worth. We are saying, how can we stretch these dollars just a little bit further to try to save these species? And so when I first met Dr. Winter in around 2018, I actually handled a paper of his as an editor before I met him. But he was asking me, he's like, why do you keep talking about preventing extinction? I said, what do you mean? I mean, I just lost all these tree snails. What do you mean? Of course I'm trying to prevent extinction. He said, well, why aren't you talking about achieving recovery? Okay, scarcity mindset, right? I can't even imagine a world in which the species I love are recovered. And so where I've kind of landed, this thought came to me as I was in my hell week before the MBA started, where they sit you in a room for 13 hours and have class for 13 hours a day for like 4 days before the school year even starts. And this thought came to me. I think there are fundamentally different questions that we have to ask to recover species than we ask to prevent extinction. I think there's actually different research we do, let alone a mindset change. And so the actions that are needed to prevent extinction are different from those that achieve recovery. And I think these are my emerging thoughts. I think it's 2 to 3 things: issues of scale, issues of technology, and issues of feasibility. And so I'm going to walk you through just a couple of things here. Oh, I moved that. I got to click on there. Okay, so there are 2 major areas that these are emerging thoughts. There are 2 major areas I think we need to resolve if we wish to grow populations of endangered species from stable to thriving. First of all, I think we have to expand from a focus on state and federally managed lands and employees to all lands and communities. So that's the first thing. And secondly, I think we've got to shift from kipuka focused conservation and small predator-free fences or small areas, which is frankly all we can do right now. Like, just doing that is the part I told you about in the first talk, right? That's $1 billion over the next 20 years. To landscape level threat eradication. Eradication is very different. That means it's gone from the islands. So I'm going to talk to you about 2 kind of emerging concepts on those things. The first one, the issues of scale. This, again, came to me during that week. I think I was trying to avoid thinking about accounting. And so this idea, they were showing this graph that, let's say you build a factory and you start hiring new workers, and eventually those workers, it's getting more efficient because they're able to diversify their jobs. So your factory is getting more efficient as you hire more people. And then all of a sudden they start bumping elbows. They're getting too crowded and your efficiency starts going down because you have too many people working there. What do you need to do at that point? Build another factory, right? And my mind was blown. I went, wait, growing, over exceeding capacity? I don't even get to think in that space, right? And so it made me think about forest conservation as an issue where essentially we have these protected areas. We focus all our effort in that protected area. We only allow state and federal workers in, and nobody else is allowed into that space. And we focus all our efforts on that tiny little space. And if that's the case, there's this concept of carrying capacity in population growth. There are only so many individuals that a certain environment can hold on to. And there's all kinds of things we can do to increase that a little bit, right? By resource supplementation, all kinds of things like that. But eventually you max out what that one space can hold. If you want to expand and actually recover species beyond being always on the brink of extinction, you've got to think about expanding. You need to think about more populations in more areas, and you only get that by collaborating with community and working outside of just state and federal lands. And so I'll draw attention to a 2021 paper with Drs. Winter and Kirishima and Fletcher and Kane, where we looked at sea level rise impacts on waterbirds. And we found that there's likely to be about a 29% loss of waterbird habitat due to sea level rise. But if you restore the lands that are possible to restore under indigenous agriculture for lo'i, you can increase waterbird nesting habitat by 130%. Okay, so that end of the spectrum, where you think about community engagement and endangered species, there is no reason we should have endangered waterbirds, absolutely none, if we restore lo'i. Now, you have to have appropriate predator control. There's lots of things like that that you've got to engage with in that space. But through partnering with communities, we can take lands that currently are full of California grass and no one has capacity to manage them, and we can actually turn them into good waterbird habitat. So finally, I mentioned effective policy as being important, and this is the final thing of scale that I want to mention. So an issue of scale and technology and feasibility. If I want to see EEV in my backyard in my lifetime, we have to figure out how to completely get rid of mosquitoes. So we have started down the pathway of figuring out Wolbachia and being able to have localized control of mosquitoes. Maybe we're just starting to test it out to maybe hold on to some of our populations for the next 20 years. But if we actually want to have them thriving across the landscape again, it breaks my heart that the last ones were seen on Oahu in 2013. I could have seen these on Oahu as a child, and I didn't know to go looking for them. I wasn't aware and thinking about them, engaging with them. And so maybe I did hear them, maybe I did see them, but they were probably at the highest elevations even then, which are kind of limited access for the public. So we have to figure that out. There's a lot of things, that's a whole nother talk for a different day, and there's other departments that are working more deeply on those particular issues. But we need a lot more work to figure out how to eradicate threats island-wide. And it would actually need to be statewide because there's a lot of planes going back and forth and different things like that. These are hard, intractable, tough problems. And there are issues of technology and scale and feasibility and funding and policies. And so, speaking of mosquitoes, I got died. So I want you to think about the future you want to live in. What does it look like? What do you hear? What do you see? What do you get to point out to your kids and grandkids and great-grandkids? Introduce them to. Is it in your backyard? Do you have to hike a long ways? Do you have to take a helicopter ride? Is it on a different island? Is it on your island? What's the future you want to live in? We are here. We are not responsible for the decisions that led to the world that we live in. But we have a point now where we have all the possibilities of all the universes that you could be living in 20 years from now. And your choices, each one of your choices and my choices, will lead us down the path of the universe that we live in 20 years from now. What's that world going to look like, and what's your role in shaping it? And so I'm excited to work with you as we think about this. In an era filled with uncertainty, our solutions need to be as big and as multidimensional as the challenges we face. You may be interested in solving different problems than I am. I'm focusing my life on solving endangered species problems, wildlife issues, conservation issues. That's where my life is focused. But I am very interested in partnering with people who are solving food problems, because you don't solve endangered species problems unless you solve human problems. You have to feed people. People need to live, right? And so, I originally had on one of these an ungulate slide, and it's a really controversial thing. We've spent a huge amount of lab time on it, and I didn't feel like I could do it justice in one slide. But a lot of families got their food from being able to hunt and fish during COVID, when the economic downturn happened and people could not access other food resources. We cannot just ignore feeding people. We won't be able to solve problems. So I look forward to working with you over the rest of my career to figure out how to achieve these big lofty goals, like transforming from being the extinction capital of the world to being the recovery capital of the world. I hope that in this time, I've been able to show you that while this is daunting and it's overwhelming and it's expensive and it's not possible today, I think it's possible in 20 years to reach those stable populations. I can see a pathway to that. And I don't think in my lifetime we get to recovered. maybe US Fish and Wildlife Service definition delisting, okay, but not to, I get to see EEV in my backyard. I don't see that happening in my lifetime, but I think I can help you lay the foundation where maybe you or your kids get to actually see them in their backyard. And so it's that future that I'm working for and that I look forward to continuing to work with you on. So thank you so much. I have about 10 minutes for questions, I think.